Hello. There are handouts over here at this little table here, along with, name tags. If anybody needs one of those, I can run and grab one for you if you'd like. But it is, 6:32, so I suppose we should get going. Thanks, everyone, for coming along again, even for a topic like Job. I've said several times to people that I'm going to try to keep it as jocular as possible over the next 4 weeks. Actually, the truth is I'm not going to, this is not going to be like a dirge for a month. I'm not really going to focus necessarily on the, languid, lengthy, poetic expressions of suffering. We can talk about that stuff as we have our little discussion time after like an hour or so of presentation. But I'm not going to harp on that. What I think is more interesting about Job is trying to get at certain things that I think that you all, I have these questions too. Things about the wager at the beginning of Job between God and the Satan. So we'll talk about that next week. I didn't want to spearhead with that because some of the things I'm going to say about that are going to maybe jostle some traditional views, okay? So I just thought, let's just start easily here, and we'll just kind of do an introduction to Job. I'll talk about things like authorship and genre. I won't make it too dry, but we'll also talk about just kind of broad, sweeping themes in the first book. And then next week we'll talk about Satan, and then we'll also talk about God and Satan, and we will talk about, the heavenly realm, because that's where Job begins, is in the heavenly realm. And then we get this we start with that bird's eye view of Job, and then we get the terrestrial view of Job for the most part for the rest of the book. So it's important to start with that heavenly, congress kind of a thing at the beginning of the text. And then week 3, I'll focus probably on God's response to Job. So this is a lengthy chunk of the latter part of Job. God responding to Job. And there's stuff in there that I'm going to tease some stuff out that you probably haven't seen before. And it's going to, I think, make Job a much more dynamic text than what we're used to. And then finally, the last week, I think what I'll do is we'll look at Job and its uses in the New Testament. So we'll see how Job continues to reverberate within the Jesus story, within the Pauline epistles, within the other texts of the New Testament. So I figure it will bring us all the way up through the New Testament text as well. So that's just kind of a quick overview of what we're going to get up to. You've got your handout here, as usual. There's bolded numbers, which are statements of mine, and then we're going to walk through those statements using text as we go. If you have any questions about stuff that pop into the top of your mind as I'm speaking, this is a small enough group, and I know you all, so just raise your hand or interrupt me. It's not a big deal. But of course, we're going to have a set 20, 30-minute period where we can actually talk some of this through. And anything you want to discuss in that period is fine. Job adjacent, Bible adjacent, anything in the realm of biblical studies is just fine. So why don't we get going? This is going to be an introduction to the book of Job. There's more that could be said here, but I've picked out a few key points, I think. So the first thing that I want to say is that the beginning of Job, the way that it starts, particularly if you can read it in Hebrew, it sounds, I have parabolic, okay? Now, I thought long and hard before using that term, parabolic. The reason for that is that Job is not a parable. No matter how we slice it, Job is not a classical parable. A parable is a very specific kind of story. It's a very specific kind of Jewish story. In Hebrew, parable is mashal, and then that Hebrew word mashal gets translated in Greek into parabole, which is where we get the word parable. So when Jesus tells a parable, usually you've got very set genre-specific stuff, like there was, two brothers and their father, and then they'll tell a story. It'll be allegorical usually, things, or like the parable of the sower, for example, is a really good one. Mark chapter 4. Sowing seed on good ground, on bad ground, and then somebody comes and scoops it up. So that's the mashal. A mashal is basically just an illustration of something. And then there's something called a nimshal at the end, which is an interpretation. Remember in the story of the sower, Jesus gives an interpretation to his disciples. The disciples are like, what are you talking about? And he goes, well, the devil comes and takes some seed, and, the ones that are sowed on bad ground, they lose faith, and, the stresses of the world, get at them. So he explains the allegory, yeah? All of that is parabolic language. So that's a specific way of speaking in the ancient Jewish world. Job does not do that, right? That is, there's nothing at the end of Job that says, and here's the allegory and here's its meaning, Because it's not an allegory, but it is not work that way. So, as an ancient Israelite reader, you would have known this immediately. And you would have said, okay, we're living in the land of epic poetry. We're living in some sort of literary framework that's going to teach me a lesson of some kind, okay? It wouldn't have struck you immediately as, an historical narrative on the order of, say, David's story in the Bible, okay? Now, that to say, I'm not saying that Job is ahistorical. You all know me at this point. My default is, unless I have a really good reason, my default is, yeah, I believe the Bible, right? Historically, I believe the Bible. I also believe genre, though, and I know how the Bible works. I know how it's set up. So for me to be as faithful to the Bible as I possibly can be, sometimes I need to let the genre take me where it wants to take me. And if I'm obstinate in that, and I say, oh no, this absolutely happened, like a video recorder was right there, and then I'm being the one who's actually at odds with the biblical text. I always want to be with the biblical text, not pushing against it. So all that to say, there's elements of parabole, if you want, but there's also historical data that we need to address, okay? And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, okay? So let's start the first sentences of Job. There was a man in the land of Uz. Job was his name. And that man was innocent and upright. He revered God and turned from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. All right. So there's a couple elements here that should be pointed out. On the level of poem, on the level of story, yeah? What do we got? Well, there once was a man in the land of, okay, yeah? All right, that sounds like Aesop, kind of, yeah? So the way that it begins is a little bit, it's like Star Wars, right? In a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Yeah, okay. Now, that said, the land of Uz is a place. It's not a completely made-up fairy tale land. It's a place that shows up elsewhere in the Bible. So that's important, right? The truth here is somewhere in the middle of parable and history, okay? And then Job was his name. All right. In Hebrew, the word Job is Eov, and it likely comes from a Hebrew root, ayav, which means to be an enemy or to be hostile. Eov, in its nounal form, means enemy, basically. And this is going to come back around very poetically, very narratively, way at the end of Job in chapter 33, verse 10, where Job says, I lived a righteous life, and yet God is treating me as an enemy. And it's the same word as his name. So it's purposeful. It's a narrative. It's done for a purpose. This person in the text is named Job because of the content of the story. Yeah? Okay. And then it says things like, all right, he was innocent and upright. That's fine. He revered God and turned away from evil. Even the way the poetry sounds in Hebrew, though, it sounds like you're sitting around a campfire. That's basically what it sounds like. And then it says there were born to Job 7 sons and 3 daughters. Anybody who has been in any of these presentations for any amount of time knows that biblical numbers have a meaning beyond the digit on the page. 7 is the number of completeness. Y'all, my Melissa's calling me. I'm going to take it, I think. Hello, darling. Byron, Melissa says that the audio is not working on the live stream. It's a good reason, good thing. So I don't know, Byron, is that something we can fix or work? Byron's working on it, babe. Okay. Okay. All right, thanks. All right, talk to you later. Love you. I mean, the height of professionalism, no, but I'll try to pull it back now and get really formal. So 7 sons and 3 daughters. 7 is the number of completeness or perfection in the Hebrew Bible. God creates the world in 7 days and rests on the 7th day. There's a reason for this. 3 is the number of a climactic event in the Bible. For instance, Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and receives the Torah from God on the 3rd day. Jonah is vomited out of the fish on the 3rd day. Jesus of Nazareth is raised from the dead on the 3rd day. All of this that's a 3-day climactic event, yeah? If you add 7 and 3, I'll bet you didn't know this is going to be a math class, you get 10. 10 is the number of creative power in the Bible. In the narrative of Genesis 1, for example, the word Vayomer, and God said, appears 10 times in the biblical text. It's the number of creative power because it's perfection plus climax equals creative event. All right, like that is, these numbers mean stuff, and so to use 7 and 3 here, it's like, okay, I get the point you're trying to make, And for Job, his whole world is actually going to be undone, It's not going to be the positive creation of Genesis 1. It's for him, in his world, it's the undoing of creation, which actually alludes to the 10 plagues in Exodus. There's a reason that there's 10 plagues, by the way, because everything God does in Exodus is to undo something of creation in Genesis 1. So, for example, the first thing God does is pool the waters together in Genesis 1. And God said, let the waters be separated from waters. And God pooled, kavah in Hebrew, pooled the waters together in order to make, this is why in Hebrew and in Judaism there's something called the mikvah, which is a pool of water where people ritually dunk. It's like baptism in Judaism. Well, mikvah comes from the word kavah, to pool something together, right? And so that's the first thing God does after the light, in Genesis. And the first plague in Exodus is blood appearing in the, quote, pools of the Egyptians. Okay? It's the same word. So everything God does, and then, it flips and flops. Like the second to last plague is darkness. The first creative move is light. The crowning achievement in Genesis is the creation of humanity. The final plague is the destruction of the firstborn, the destruction of humanity. Everything fits together in this puzzle. Okay? But there's a reason for that. 10 and 10 is equals creative power. What God's doing in Exodus is undoing God's own creation. What does it tell us? It tells us the God of Israel loves the people of Israel so much that God is willing to undo the creation of Genesis 1 to achieve liberation for the people of Israel. So when you have a handle on these numbers, right, and their meanings and how they function in the Bible, A, the Bible becomes much more interesting, but then B, since I'm so soaked in these ideas, that when I read that Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters, I don't think that he had 7. Right? I'm not thinking in terms of it's historically accurate, retelling, like there's a video camera there. Okay, so that's the parabole on the one hand, yeah, if you want, the kind of storied flavor of the material. But as I said, at the same time, the land of Uz is a place that's mentioned throughout the Bible in historical literature. So this is B under number 1, where Jeremiah lists a bunch of cities and their kings. And here's the list. Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, its kings and its officials, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and all the kings of the land of Uz. All right, done. Jeremiah wouldn't have put it there if it were a fairy tale place. It's a real place. And it's right smack dab in the middle of all these other places that are real. Uz is like an ancient, kind of like the southern pocket of Mesopotamia. So think of where like Abraham came out of. sort of Uz-ish, a little south of Abraham. At least we think. Alternatively, in Lamentations, we talk about Edom. The text talks about the people group of Edom, who's a kind of southeast neighbor of Israel. Edom would be like modern-day Jordan, sort of, maybe a little east. And it says, Edom, i.e. the people who dwell in the land of Uz. So, like, Edom's a real place. I mean, Esau is the namesake of Edom. There's no, to put Job in the land of Uz is to place him in real geography. Okay. And then also in Ezekiel, for instance, this is D, we get Job named by name. God speaks through Ezekiel saying, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in that land, they would deliver only their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord. So God is not happy with the nation of Israel and is basically saying, look, even if you had these three righteous people in the midst of you, that wouldn't save you. They would save themselves through their righteousness, but not you. So Ezekiel knows of an historical personage named Job, just like he knows of an historical personage named Noah and Daniel. I'm inclined to, just agree with the biblical text, right? And what does that mean from my perspective? It would mean allowing, believing, asserting, agreeing that Job exists in history and in time and in place, actual geography, and that this particular writer or group of writers of Job are telling a story about this historical person to make a point. It's a didactic, it's a teaching tool for them. And it's an epic poem. Honestly, the whole, did this exactly happen precisely how it's written? But people ask me this kind of thing all the time. And again, as I say, my default is usually to just go, yeah, because we don't have evidence to the contrary, But this text is about what happens in the heavenly realm, and then it zooms down to the earthly realm, and God's talking to Satan, and it's what? That is, the ancient reader would have allowed for a certain kind of narrative elasticity to say, okay, I know Job, I know this is a person, and I know that you're going to use this now. You're going to set this up. You're rolling out the red carpet of this epic poem. So that's kind of how I would approach Job. And the rest of the Bible, there are other biblical books that do this too, that take this tack. They teach a story through an historical personage. Job, Jonah is a prophet mentioned in the books of Kings. And then Jonah has his own text, the book of Jonah, right? Where he's swallowed by a big fish, a dag gadol. I was hoisted on my own petard there. I always tell my students it's not a whale, it's a big fish. In any case, that's basically how I would approach Job. In the end, I don't think this argument matters. I really don't. And if you put me in a corner, I would never die on the hill of these questions. It just doesn't. For me, it just doesn't really matter. I'm much more interested in what the text has to tell us. But that said, I certainly do not deny the historicity of Job. Okay. So speaking of that question, things like historicity, things like geography, things like date, I thought it might be interesting to show you some of the earliest discussion in Judaism about Job and these questions. So these rabbis would have lived a few hundred years after Jesus. And, I've alluded to some of this material before in these lectures, but it's just debate, it's dialogue, it's discussion. These people in the 3rd century AD didn't have special insight into the time of Job or Abraham. It's not like Rabbi A has a secret that nobody else knows, Rabbi A must be right. And then Rabbi B goes, oh, no, he's wrong. Well, how could Rabbi B actually know that he, it's just, they're just talking, okay? Because to talk about the Bible is to worship for the rabbis. It's a mode of worship. It's a mode of prayer. So they discuss all these things. For example, in A, this is from Genesis Rabbah. This is a a midrash, a commentary on the book of Genesis. And they're talking about Job, as you do when you're supposed to be talking about Genesis. Stay on topic, guys. But so one rabbi jumps in and says, hey, when did Job flourish? Or when did Job live? And Rabbi Simon said, in the days of Abraham. For in his story, that is in the story of Abraham, it says Uz is his firstborn. All right, that's Genesis 22:21. And it is written here in Job, there was a man in the land of Uz. Okay. Now, this is not what we would call historically rigorous logic, all right? Basically, they're just taking, the word Uz, who's actually the name of a person in Genesis, also shows up as the name of a place in Job. And since we're talking about the time of Abraham in Genesis, we must be talking about the time of Abraham and Job. Whatever. This is not scientific work being done here, all right? This is word association across the biblical corpus. But this is the way that the rabbis get at the material, which I think is actually extremely admirable. This is the way we should all read the Bible, by the way. Not to come to, I would say, spurious conclusions like this, but to just say, look, the phrase shows up here and it shows up here. What can we learn about both of these texts, noting that the phrases reappear, okay? So the rabbis are geniuses at this. So did Job live in the time of Abraham? Maybe. We don't know. The text doesn't tell us. Or they go on. This is in the Babylonian Talmud. This is a massive commentary on what's called the Mishnah, which is the first Jewish corpus of discussion after the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. So the Mishnah postdates the Gospels by about 200 years, 150 years. And the Talmud is a much later commentary on the Mishnah. And the Talmud goes up and down and in and around and moves and talks about all sorts of different stuff. So they get on the question of which figures wrote the biblical books. All right. So here's some discourse on this. Moses wrote his own book, they say, i.e. the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And Moses also wrote Job. Okay. Is there actual textual evidence for this? No. But then they go on. Okay, if that's true, then this supports Rabbi Levi, who says that Job lived in the time of Moses, because it's written here in Job, quoting Job 19:23, that my words were written here. So that word here in Hebrew is apho. So what they're doing is they're putting their finger on that one word here, okay? And it's also written there in the Moses books, okay? So they're citing Exodus 33. For how shall it be known here, apho? All right. So Rabbi Levi's big proof for the fact that Job lived in the time of Moses is that the word apho here appears both in Job and in the Torah of Moses. Again, compelling? No. Do I love these guys with every fiber of my being? Yes. Because they rock. And, there are no search engines in the early centuries AD. They've got it all up in their noodle. They're geniuses. All right. Okay, but then another, a kind of nameless voice, all right, interjects in the Talmud. This happens all the time. So Rabbi A will say this, Rabbi B will say this, and then a group of rabbis or students will come in. All right? It's called the stam. It's like the voiceless, the nameless voice. And so this other group, think of it as like a group of students who then interject. And they say, okay, so this is what Rabbi Levi says. But if that's the proof, okay, then one could say that Job lived in the time of Isaac or in the time of Jacob or in the time of Joseph, since all of their stories contain that one word, apho, here. And they note every time that it shows up in the discussion. I didn't put it here for space. So quite right. That's correct. All right. And then another rabbi jumps in and says, Job was among those who ascended to Jerusalem from the exile in Babylon. So notice what we've got. We've got Job lived in the time of Abraham, according to the first Midrash. Job lived in the time of Moses, according to the first text in the first opinion in the Talmud. And then the students jump in and say, well, he could have lived in the time of of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then a final voice comes in and goes, no, he didn't live in any of those times. He lived in the time when the exiles were living in Babylon and came home to Jerusalem. So this last opinion puts him what's called post-exilically. The exile happens in 586 BC. And so basically what this last opinion is saying, no, Job lived in the Second Temple period. Job lived in the 200-300 years before Jesus. That's a wide variety of opinion, right? Why is there so much variety of opinion? Because none of these people knows the answer. And no one knows the answer. And I'll tell you why we don't know the answer. Because the text doesn't tell us. Which is, I guess, that's the moral of this entire thing, right? Whatever the text says, we agree with. Whatever it doesn't say, we don't speculate about, right? I know that it makes for less interesting Bible studies in the morning, but it really is the better way to go. And again, I think this rabbinic stuff is wildly entertaining. I love it, but I don't take it as gospel, right? All right, so moving on. This is the same passage of that Babylonian Talmud. And this is where it gets really interesting when it comes to rabbinic opinion. There is this guy called Rabbi Shmuel, so Rabbi Samuel. And they tell this little story. It says, so one of the sages, one of the rabbinic scholars, said Job never existed and was never created. Rather, his story was a parable. So there is our Hebrew word for parable, mashal. Now, right off the bat, I said Job's not a parable, so I disagree with this sage. I don't think it's a parable. But the sage is trying to be cheeky for the sake of being, cheeky, I guess. But this sage says, oh no, Job never existed, right? So he doesn't believe in the historicity of Job. Then Rabbi Samuel said to him, the verse states in response to, the verse states in rebuttal to you, quote, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. All right. So then the anonymous source of the Talmud, those students, jump in again. And so in response to Rabbi Samuel's citation, the Talmud asks, quote, but if that's so, that Job 1:1 proves Job's existence, right? Because Rabbi Samuel says, of course Job existed. It says in the first sentence, there was a man who lived in the land of Uz. Done, right? So then the Talmud itself, later students, they jump in and they say, but if that's the proof here, why don't we just compare Nathan's parable to David, okay? Which begins, there were two men in one city, one rich and the other poor. And the poor man had nothing but a little lamb and that he bought and reared. So that's 2 Samuel 12:3. And then the Talmud asks, was there ever such a man, this poor man? Instead, it's merely a parable. Here, too, it's a parable. But if that's so, another group of students jumps in, then why state Job's name and the name of his city? And then guess what happens in the Talmud discourse? They change the subject. They end on a question. It shows you that they're not creating dogmas, right? Thou shalt and must believe X, Y, Z. That's Christian. That's not traditionally Jewish, okay? When I say Christian, I mean post-New Testament, post-first Jewish movement, Gentile Christian. Because Christianity is, I've said this many times before, Christianity is, by definition, an evangelizing faith. It's meant to get all the nations under the umbrella of the one God of Israel. Whereas Judaism is both a faith and an ethnicity. So if you're born Jewish, if you are born and by dint of your birth you're one of God's people, which is the Jewish view, then you can't get kicked out of that, no matter how egregious your point of view is. You can say Job never existed. You can say Job definitely existed. You can say maybe he did, and let's talk out this more, and you're still in the group. Whereas in Christianity, if you're Irish or Moldavian or Malaysian, right, you're not born into the covenant of God. Hence, it really matters what's bobbling around in your head. If you get that wrong, right, that's what makes us in or out, yeah? Because our ethnicity doesn't, because we're ethnically diverse. which is part of the point. It's part of the point of the Bible, too. The Bible always has this vision of ethnically diverse nations coming under the umbrella of the one God. But when that happens, you got to have an in and an out mechanism. So the in and the out mechanisms are different between Gentile Christianity, so like 4th, 5th, 6th century Christianity, and 4th, 5th, 6th century Judaism. All right, so this discussion in the Talmud. The one guy says he never existed. Rabbi Samuel jumps in and takes the opposite pole. He definitely existed because he's named and his town is or his land is named. And then the other Talmudic group goes, yeah, but a man exists in Nathan's parable, and that's clearly a parable. That man never existed in real life. Fair, that's true, good. And then the last voice is, yeah, but in Job it says his name and the name of his city. And so just for me to be cheeky and to join in the rabbinic discussion, I added this last thing from Luke 10:30. This is the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus begins a parable. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Okay, that's stating two place names. Does it mean the man exists in real life? No. I'm just saying. All right. I think Job existed, by the way, okay? What I'm trying to do is just to say, there are a variety of different ways to approach this material. Or, if you're like, all right, well, yeah, but if I were in the Talmudic discussion, another rabbi would jump in and go, yeah, but Nick, it doesn't say his name, the man's name, right? The Samaritan man is never named. Job is named, yeah? And then I would just say, all right, there was a poor man named Lazarus, right? And begging at the feet of a rich man for food. And that's also Luke. That's Luke chapter 16. Did Lazarus really exist in real life? I'd think not. Now, I also, to make matters worse, I actually don't think that Luke 16, the rich man and Lazarus story, is a parable. Because there's no elements of parable in it, okay? It's a story, but you can have a story without a parable. Remember I said a parable is an extremely specific allegory, interpretation kind of a story. The rich man and Lazarus story is not that. But in any case, you could go on and on and on about this. I just thought it might be cool for you to step in to get a window into some of this discussion. And just to say, too, that, you can't be more Bible-believing than the rabbis, okay? We might, think of ourselves as very faithful people today, but there's nobody that holds a candle to these guys. And because these are kind of the folks who lived a couple hundred years after Jesus. So I would put Jesus in this kind of rabbinic camp, too. In fact, Jesus of Nazareth is the first person in recorded history ever to be called a rabbi, meaning in written form, the word rabbi first appears in the New Testament, which is funny because the New Testament is written in Greek, not in Hebrew. And rabbi is a Hebrew word, ravi. It means my great one or my teacher. But in the Greek, if you read the Greek of the New Testament, the Greek writers write the word rabbi in Greek. It's called transliteration. They're taking a Hebrew word and putting it into Greek. So Jesus is the first person in recorded history, textual history, to ever be called a rabbi. And so, these guys are unassailable, right? And yet they felt comfortable discussing these kinds of questions. This is not impious. For them, it would have been the height of piety to even have talks like this. And they would, yell at each other. If somebody said something super, quasi-blasphemous, they'd be like, you need to knock that off, right? But it was a safe space for them to discuss the Bible. Okay, so those are some considerations about date, genre, things like that, just as in kind of introductory matters. Yeah, sure. Good, yeah, Jen. Yeah, if we don't know when Job was written, do we know who wrote Job? But the answer to both those questions is no. I could say a quick word briefly about the language of Job. It's beautiful. It's written in Hebrew, but there's a lot of Aramaic words. Aramaic is the language of Jesus. But his Aramaic would have been a late version of what's in Job. But Job is trying to sound old-timey for the sake of it. Because remember, it begins in a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, for all intents and purposes. So it's trying to sound hyper old. If you backed me into a corner, I would say that Job is written after the exile to Babylon. But I could never die on that hill, right? Because I don't have enough information. But oftentimes the biblical writers will sound super old-timey, and you can tell it's like reading Chaucer versus reading like modern English. Like it's so, which is part of the reason why Job is extremely difficult to translate. It's a nightmare. It's the hardest book of the Bible to translate by far. I wouldn't wish it on like an enemy. I wouldn't on Eov. So like, but it's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's really, really well composed. It's just really hard to translate. So yeah, I would say it's a Second Temple period text that sounds retrojected to the way back when time. But again, for our purposes, it doesn't matter if it was actually written in the time of Abraham or Moses or not, because the content of the narrative is what's important to us. If we get to the end and if we're still got our heads sunk in the sands of did Job write Job question, we've missed 42 chapters of the point. Yeah, that is, our brains are digging their heels in and not doing what the author or authors of this text want us to do, which is to think about more elevated things. But yeah, unfortunately, Jan, we don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. It was probably written by a school of writers, to be honest, and kind of what's called redacted, that is edited together. But again, like that doesn't devalue whatever the truth of the Bible, right? Has no bearing on that at all. It could have been written by one person. It could be written by 1,000 people. It doesn't matter at all, right? In terms of the teaching that we're to glean from it, or its authoritativeness as a divine text, or anything like that. All those things I would affirm, right? Questions of authorship and date and stuff are ancillary. Cool. Any other quick questions before we move on to number 3? Yeah. Yeah, does Job predate any other text? It certainly does. Job, I think, is like soon after the exile, maybe in the Persian period, whereas something like, I think it would probably be like Proverbs is maybe a little bit later than Job. Daniel, I would date later than Job, despite the fact that Daniel, again, is a narrative that narrates the time of the Babylonian exile and then the Persian period. It's actually written, to my eye, in the 160s BC. So I think Daniel's the latest text of the Bible that we have. Again, it's not to say the content talks about that late period. It talks about a much earlier period. But just like Job is written at a later period and talks about an earlier period, I think Daniel does that too. Ecclesiastes also is quite late. It might probably post-dates Job. So, yeah. Some of the Psalms certainly post-date Job. Yeah, quite a lot of the material post-dates Job. Cool. All right, let's talk about some broad strokes about what's going on in this book. Why is it written the way that it's written? What's the broad point it's trying to make? And remember, it's written by a Hebrew speaker or a Hebrew writer. This is an Israelite. This is a person who believes themselves to be in God's covenant as a Jewish individual. This is a person who is deeply soaked in the biblical material that predates Job. And so the text is purposefully framing itself in terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Now, whether Job's an Israelite that was debated too by the rabbis, right? Is Job Jewish, or is Job an Edomite, or is Job something else? I think it's probably best to understand Job as a non-Israelite in this text because he's from the land of Uz, which is outside the land of Israel. And I think it's trying to universalize the figure to say whether you're in the covenant with God or outside the covenant with God, you can relate to this text either way. Because again, it's talking about big theological things. But it's couched in biblical speak, in biblical presuppositions about the way God works and about the way Israel works, God's chosen people. So despite Job's innocence, Job suffers the Torah's curses for rebellion against God. What happens to Job is very specific. It is reminiscent of this list of curses that are listed at the end of Leviticus and the end of Deuteronomy. And these texts are saying, like, if you disobey the covenant, the Mosaic Torah, right? If you don't do the stipulations of the Torah, all these bad things are going to happen. It's kind of a downer way to end Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but that's sort of how it ends. It doesn't quite end like that. It ends up a little bit more upbeat. But in any case, this is Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. And, there's just some Hebrew in here that for anybody, again, who's like, reared on the biblical material, particularly in Hebrew, it's so obvious that this is couching this in covenantal language. So, for example, the Lord said to Satan, this is in Job chapter 2, "Look, Job is in your hand, only spare his life." So Satan went out from before the Lord and struck Job with bad boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. So the phrase in Hebrew, bad boils, is shechin ra. Ra in Hebrew is evil or bad. Shechin is a boil. So shechin ra is very specific language. And this thing I have underlined, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, very specific language. Like, that's straight up Moses Torah speak. So if you flip to the other side of your handout, I'll show you how this works. So Job, right, is innocent. He loves God. He's not evil, right? He's done nothing wrong. And yet he's hit with these boils. Well, that would have sparked in the mind of the ancient Israelite reader the story of the plagues in Egypt, without question. So first, Exodus chapter 9, this is B at the top of your sheet. Moses threw soot into the air, and it became shechin, same word in Job, boils, breaking out in sores on human and on animal. And the Egyptian magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. So immediately, if you're an Israelite writer, you're thinking, okay, I was just told that Job loves God. And in the heavenly narrative that we'll talk about next week, God says, hey, Satan, have you seen my servant Job? It's pretty awesome, right? Like, really good, shuns evil, upright, really good guy. And that's how it all starts. So God loves Job, too. So for Job to be hit with boils, i.e. the plague against the Egyptians, is just like, everything's upside down now. This is topsy-turvy. This isn't supposed to happen, God. You attack our enemies with these boils. You don't attack your friends, And then, again, this resonance of Job's name meaning enemy, It discombobulates. It would have discombobulated the first readers of this material. And then we get Deuteronomy 28, which is, again, that list of both blessings at the front end and then curses at the back end. And part of the curse is really interesting. It says this: it recalls the plagues in Egypt, and then it has the material on which Job draws. It says this: the Lord will strike you, right? If you don't do the Torah, if you don't do the stipulations of God's legal system, the Lord will strike you with the boils of Egypt, and with tumors and scabs and itch from which you can't be healed. Remember, Job is sitting with like pottery shards and scraping the boils off him because they're itching him. That's this. The Lord will strike you on the knees and on the legs with bad boils. Shechin ra. It's the same phrase in Job, of which you can't be healed from the sole of your foot to the crown of your head. It's clear that the writer or writers of Job know Deuteronomy backwards and forwards. And so Job is experiencing the stuff that rebellious people, rebellious Israelites are supposed to experience. But Job's done nothing wrong. So I'm trying to express, right, what this would do to the reader, yeah? To the Hebrew reader. One of the things, it would not only shock, there's shock and awe. Oh my gosh, the whole world is turned upside down, right? There's the shock element, which is what the writer's trying to do to us. But it would also take you out. Like, it would say, okay, I get it. You're making a point. you are making a point, because bad things happen to the people who follow the Torah. In my lived experience as an ancient Israelite, I know this happens. And God, I know what it says at the end of Deuteronomy. I know that if we do the Torah rightly, we'll be blessed. If we don't do it, we'll be cursed. What happens to the people who do it rightly? And still horrible things happen. So it's just so obvious that this is a story for the purposes of making huge and important theological claims and assertions and questions. By the way, if you've read Job, you realize that there's no answer to this question at the end. Because that's not the point. This is classic. Like, the rabbis would have loved this. It's just one long discussion about the fact that bad things happen to good people. And at the end, it's like, what do we do with that? There's no answer. There's no real answer. There's some answers, sort of. But this text is not a story about why bad things happen to good people. This is why I wrote number 4 very specifically. Job is an epic meditation on the fact that bad things happen to good people. It's not even asking why, really. It knows it. What it's asking is not why bad things happen in general, but what happens when bad things happen when there's a God who set up this Torah system, yeah? Who set up this covenantal system, who says in Deuteronomy, if you do bad, these bad things will happen. Well, we can look around and we just know that that's not necessarily always the case, right? And in fact, if you keep reading in Job, his 3 friends are going to show up, who I'll get to in a second. But his 3 friends are going to show up, and basically, all they're going to say, in a nutshell, is, you must have done something wrong. More or less, that is their grand genius claim. But we as readers know that's not true. In fact, the writer in chapter 2 and 3 says specifically, in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. He never does. Now, I think Job is a little self-serving. I think Job is a little self-centered. I think that Job is maybe a little bit insular and less concerned about God and more concerned about himself. All of things, by the way, that I don't want to rap Job on the wrist for that. If you had boils from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet, you can do the woe is me game for a while, I think. And the friends are horrible, by the way. In fact, later on in Job 19, Job's going to say, my friends have become my enemies. This goes back to the Job enemy trope that we see in the text. These are not his friends. By the end of the text, they're not his friends. They're his enemies, really. But, so they're horrible. I mean, they make it all worse for him, I think. But the point is not to fix that issue. Job is not a panacea for our suffering. It doesn't even claim to be. It never says, come to the end of this and I'll give you the secret wisdom to live a happy life, despite suffering. Nothing like that at all. It is laying its cards on the table. It's getting real. And it's saying, what do we do with this? It's asking questions. It's a meditation. It's a poetic meditation on the problem. So but then we get Job's initial response. Yeah, he's upset. Not only is he hit with boils and stuff, which doesn't happen until chapter 2, his whole family is basically killed by marauders. We'll get back to them when we talk about the New Testament because there's some important stuff going on there. But Job, to his credit, he responds this way initially. Job rose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And so, he's not running away from God. He's not Jonah trying to get on a ship to Nineveh. He sits where he sits, he gets on his knees, and he talks to God. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Okay. Now, he's going to say some pretty cheeky stuff over the course of this text, which is very interesting. Man, some of the stuff Job says is wild, which actually provides a template for us, too, from a practical prayer perspective. This is within the authoritative tradition of ancient Israel and the scriptures of the Old Testament, right? It's okay to talk to God this way. God can take it. In fact, it's encouraged, this kind of rhetoric. The way that Job talks to God, getting angry at God, asking questions of God, being uncertain, saying, look, I feel like you're my enemy. I don't want anything to do with you right now. All of that is bound up in this text. But it's part of sacred scripture. I mean, that's great. It's wonderful. And it gives templates. It's freeing in our relationship with God. Yeah? We don't want to be vindictive. We don't want to be like, petulant, right, with God. But if the bad things happen, heck yeah, let her rip. God can take it. And Job gives us a good template for that. Okay, then Job's three friends, they show up. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And you're going to get another fellow later on. We'll get to him, later on. So here is what happens with these three so-called friends. They make an appointment together, and they come to show Job sympathy and to comfort him. And they raised their voices, and they wept, and they tore their robes, just like Job does, and they sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with Job on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. There's our number 7 again. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that he was suffering. His suffering was very great. This is like the best approach possible for people who are mourning or suffering, by the way. When these friends start opening their mouth, things start going wrong. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so great question. So sitting Shiva, okay? Sitting Shiva is a Jewish custom for mourning at funerals. Shiva comes from Sheva in Hebrew, which means 7. It comes directly from this story. So the rabbis talk about what we should do when people are in mourning, and the answer is go sit with them for 7 days, because that's what Job's friends do. And this sets the template to this day. Sometimes it's shaloshim, it's 3 days, depending on your denomination. But in the more Orthodox traditions, it's 7 days. And so you'll come to a person's house, you'll leave at some point in the evening, but you'll eat and you'll spend time with them, and you'll do it over the course of a week. That comes from this. And then also there's a wordplay. They came and sat with him. The word for sat is yashav in Hebrew. It sounds like shiv'ah, yashav. It's got the same root, so it's kind of a wordplay. You sit for 7 days and 7 nights. Again, this is just the number of completeness. Yeah? Did they actually sit for 7 days and 7 nights? That's not what the text is concerned with. It's saying they were completely sympathetic to his plight, and they just kept their mouths shut, and they mourned alongside him. Oftentimes, we're tempted to say something, when a loved one dies, or trying to comfort somebody, at a funeral or a wake. Or I must say, let's follow the Bible. It's better to just hug that person and to weep, and to just know that you're there for that person. I think when we start voicing our theologies, like Job's friends do, things can go awry very, very quickly. I know we're trying to do it from a good place. We're trying to help our loved ones, but I don't think it's a good practice, at least not initially. Wait 7 days before you send an email or write a card or something. So they sit with him for 7 days and 7 nights. That's wonderful. And then Eliphaz decides to speak. And Job, in chapter 3, had said some things. He's upset. He's voicing, he's mournful. Everything's going wrong. And then Eliphaz responds, finally, and says to Job, remember, if you would. Okay, here we go. Not the way to start this. Yeah, so he's like on his high horse, Well, if you remember, come on, man. Like, not a good approach. Whoever perished being innocent. What a horrible thing to say to him. Because we know as readers that he is innocent. Eliphaz doesn't know, but we know. So we should be angry with Eliphaz. And indeed, God gets angry with Eliphaz at the end of the text. So we should be in the position, we have the bird's eye view. We know what's going on. We even know why Job's suffering in the first place, because God and Satan made a wager about it in the heavenly realm, unbeknownst to Job. Yeah? So we know all this. Eliphaz doesn't. At what point were the upright cut off, in history? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. You reap what you sow, right? Not untrue. It's not untrue. Paul in Galatians says something very similar. So it's not wrong. We see it even outside of biblical context. People reap what they sow, right? Fine. But is that a good thing to say to Job right now? No, because Job is innocent. Job didn't do anything wrong. And we as readers know that. But then Job says something super interesting. He actually agrees with Eliphaz about this general point, this general theological point, that like bad things happen to bad people and you reap what you sow, karma, for lack of a better term. Job answers Eliphaz and says, Amen. It's actually in the plural in Hebrew. There's a mem at the end of it, which is like a pluralization. So it's like amens, like multiple amens. Like, I get it. Amen, by the way, means correct. Yes, let it be so. 100%. That's basically what amen says. So he goes, amen. I know that's the case. But how can a person be righteous next to God? If one wished to contend with God, one could not answer him once in 1,000 times. God is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who's hardened himself against him and succeeded? Though I am in the right, says Job, and he knows. By the way, he is. He is. It's not like he's being, he's not talking back to God here. We know he's in the right. I cannot answer God. I must appeal for mercy to my judge. This is taking us through a classical human experience, right? If you're suffering, if a loved one is suffering, you're talking to God. Sometimes the answers are not coming. You feel perhaps a bit of distance when you're praying to God. And God's unassailable. We're not. What can I do, says Job? I've got to just appeal to my judge, right? I've got to appeal for divine mercy. And that's important because Job knows that God is merciful. So there's this thing in the back of Job's mind the whole time. He's going through this suffering, but he constantly is referring to God's mercy. So ultimately, and then God ultimately is merciful. I guess we can talk about that at the end, but Job gets back, more children and more livestock and stuff. So I don't know. It'd still be tricky. But the narrative itself is trying to tie that up in a bow to say, look, like God comes through in the end. But this is only Job chapter 9. I mean, Job is blind to what is going to happen here. Who can be righteous next to God? Very true. That's very true. Who's hardened himself against God and never succeeded? That's Exodus language again, right? Because remember, Pharaoh hardens himself against God very famously. So the writer of Job knows the story of the Exodus and Deuteronomy and is playing on all of that stuff. So Job does a good thing. I mean, rather than hardening his heart against God, he's unhappy, but he's also open to divine mercy. And I think also aware that it's going to come at some point, trusting in God's mercy. Finally, I'll do this quickly because it's 7:30. Job's friends offer answers for his suffering, but God rejects their views in the end. So we know that they're wrong. So when you go through Job on your own, every time Bildad starts talking or Zophar starts talking, God ultimately says everything they said was bogus, particularly about me. When they start talking about me, they're wrong, okay? And what's interesting is what Job says about God is right, that God says, which is really interesting because he says some pretty stuff about God. All right, here, I'm just going to give you some quick examples, all right? And this will hopefully kind of set us on a course. If you want to read through Job, slowly over the course of the next month, I would encourage you to do that. So here's Eliphaz, the first friend, for example, in Job 22. He says to Job, is it for your fear of God that God enters into judgment with you? That is, do you really have reverence for God? You must have done something wrong. Is not your evil abundant? There's no end to your iniquities. But the thing is, as readers, we know that's wrong. That's not true. He thinks it's true, so he's not outright lying because he doesn't have all the facts. But Eliphaz just assumes that Job must have done something wrong. Or Bildad, does God pervert justice? If you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you're pure and upright, God will protect you and grant you well-being to your righteous home. That word for upright is yashar. That's the very same word as the beginning of Job. Job was righteous and upright. We know that he's upright. We know that Bildad doesn't know what he's talking about. Or Zophar. Zophar does it actually a little bit better, I think, and says, look, if iniquity is in your hand, if you've sinned, I don't know that you have, I'm not accusing you necessarily, but if you've done it, just put it far away from you. Repent, basically, is what he's saying. And your life will be brighter than the noonday. Okay, I think that's a little softer than the others, but we know that's wrong too, because he has nothing to repent about, and his life is not brighter than the noonday right now. This is supposed to be churning at the reader, because we're with Job. What's happening here? Why is this suffering happening? Job didn't do anything wrong. So then later in Job chapter 42, at the end, God's going to respond to Eliphaz and his friends and say this to Eliphaz, quote, my anger burns against you and your two friends, for you haven't spoken of me what's right, as my servant Job has. So it's a kind of fun exercise to go back through Job and to just note, take a little notepad and note when Job says stuff about God, and whatever is in there is spot on, according to God. And then you can go through the friends, and whatever they say about God directly, you can know that that's not true of God. Now, I don't want to approach this long, epic, ancient, creaky, cool poem in a too systematic a way, I'm not saying there's a puzzle you just put together and Bob's your uncle, you've understood Job. But it is a fun exercise to look through the rhetoric of all of these different figures. All right, last thing. Job, and I've just kind of put a series of Job's rhetoric together, okay, to see this kind of stuff that he says about God. Remember, God himself says that Job spoke rightly about God. Listen to some of this stuff. Here's Job. The arrows of the sustainer are in me. And that's God he's talking about. The arrows are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Okay, that's heavy. And then later on in the chapters, Job says, with God are wisdom and might. True enough. He has counsel and understanding. True enough. If he tears down, none can rebuild. True enough. God will actually say something quite similar to that in the response to Job. Fine. And then another interesting thing in chapter 19, which is a really interesting chapter that we'll get back to. Job says, I know my Redeemer lives. And at the last time, in the end, he will stand upon the earth. I shall see God, and my eyes shall behold the Lord. So what's really cool about this is all the suffering Job's undergoing, and all this feeling of, why is this happening to me? God is my enemy. The arrows, God is shooting arrows right down from heaven at me. That's how he feels. As he goes on, he says, look, that doesn't preclude my relationship with God. I feel like God's against me right now, but I know in the end, my Redeemer lives. And he's probably talking about God here, okay? That is, God's going to redeem me, and God will stand upon the earth. At some point, I'm going to see the face of God. I'll behold the face of the Lord. So there's this faith that Job's going to come through this. Job might not survive it, yeah? But in the end, God is a redeemer. God is merciful. And Job is going to meet God and be able to speak about this event. That is, no amount of suffering in this world eliminates continued relationship with God, either in this world or in the world to come, according to Job. And it is what it is, right? What are your other options as an ancient Israelite? So if you feel you're suffering, you don't really have the option to go, all right, well, I'm just going to be an atheist now. That wasn't an option back then, They didn't have that idea even. No, I'm a covenantally bound human being to my Creator, my God, who chose me and my parents and their parents. This is my lot, and I need to live with, push back against, question within this particular covenantal framework. Okay, I'll stop there. It's 7:37. I think we have until 8. Are there any questions or comments or whatever? Yeah, Jim. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Sure. Yeah. So just to reiterate the question, I've said several times, there are different religions, there are different cultures who are neighbors of Israel who have their own gods and their own beliefs and their own temples. And part of the assertion of the Bible is that the God of Israel is the best of all those gods. Our God is superior to these other gods. And does Job, contribute to that discourse, or the idea that despite all of our suffering, God will remain with us? Absolutely, yes. There's this kind of fight between God and the Satan, which we'll get to. The Satan himself is a divine being, okay, meaning he's not a terrestrial being, And so there's this kind of discourse between God and the Satan, and that kind of serves as a kind of calque for that idea that the God of Israel knows best versus other divine pretenders, if you will. But it doesn't do a lot of mentioning of other people's gods in this text, except at the end, which I'll get to in a few weeks. But in order to see the other god stuff, you have to know what you're looking for. It's not plainly apparent. In any case, the idea that Job, and we'll talk about this when we get to the New Testament, this is week 4, but Job undergoes horrible suffering, not only to himself, but to his family. Remember, the Chaldeans, quote unquote, come in and they sweep in and they burn his home and they kill his kids and stuff. Well, the Chaldeans is an ancient, antique name for the Babylonians. It's where Abraham was from, Ur of the Chaldees. But that's Babylonia. And the Babylonians are the ones who killed and exiled the Israelites in 586. This is part of the reason why I think that Job is written after the Babylonian exile, because it's using Job as a kind of individual representative of the entire nation of Israel. We as a nation suffer terribly in exile, in death, and yet we have to believe that our God remains with us. And in truth, even the writing of the text of Job after the exile is testament to that theological reality, that God remains with them. Because this writer never could have written this text had the Israelites been abandoned in Babylon and God had not brought them home. Right? So the writer's standing on the other side of the suffering, just like we get to the end of Job and we're on the other side of Job's suffering. So absolutely, Jim, and I'll unpack some of that stuff as we move forward. Anything else? Yeah, thank you. So what we're talking about here is the fact that Job gets more kids and more livestock, and God sort of redoubles his possessions, and everything's happy at the end. And is it a kind of modern Western perspective to get to the end and be like, well, thanks, but, right? No, absolutely not. The Bible, ancient Israelite familial life was obviously deeply concerned with, dependent on the integrity of the family. So when you have a child, for example, who dies in the biblical text, right, or you can't have a child or something like that, it's just the worst possible event that you could possibly think of. Remember, to go back to David, we talked about the parable of Nathan to David after he commits adultery with Bathsheba and basically murders Uriah. His son, this is easily the most difficult text in the whole Bible, in my opinion, by the way. His infant son dies. David doesn't die for his sin, but the infant son dies. And the whole time that the son is dying, sick, David is fasting and on his knees and praying to God, and the son still dies. It's easily, it's the toe stubbing, right? It's the theological toe stubber text that I can't get around. I still am not, it's still like it gnaws at me. But you know how long the baby suffers before the baby dies? 7 days, right? This is the Jobian stuff. So did the baby really suffer for 7 days in history? No, I don't think so. I think the digit is pointing to some sort of complete thing, right? But in any case, it's still horrible. When you get an event like that, the Bible pours its heart out over that narrative, right? So there's just no way that the end, I think we're supposed to feel like, because they would have. The ancient Israelites, to lose a child, to lose a wife, to lose a husband, is the worst possible outcome you could have. It's still this to today, but I'm trying to put you in the place of the ancient. I mean, you're a widow, you're in rough shape. You don't have any backing financially now. This is why groups of widows used to get together and do like textiles and things like that, because they need to support each other. If you lose a son or a daughter, your progeny, it's so important. I don't think it's just a Western perspective. I think we're supposed to have our eyebrow raised at the end of this text and just go, was it all worth it? Yeah. It does indeed. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. She has some things to say at the outset of Job, and then she just sort of takes a step back from the narrative, and that's that. It's interesting. I'm trying to think of like what she might represent. I said that Job, I think, represents Israel and their historical national suffering. And I'm just trying to figure out what I think she's a catalyst, basically, to say, here's your first option. And what does she say? Curse God and die. Interestingly, in the Masoretic tradition, in the Hebrew text family that we have of the Old Testament, the rabbis who preserve that material, and they dot it with little dots, so it's called vowel pointing, so that we know how to best pronounce the material, because ancient Hebrew has no vowels in it. So this group called the Masoretes, they preserve the material, they edit it, they kind of put it all together, and when they get to this point where Job's wife says, "Curse God and die," the rabbis couldn't bring themselves to preserve that. In the Masoretic family tradition, it says, "Bless God and die." It's a euphemism, right? But they couldn't do it. Yeah? So bless God and die, but really it's like wink, wink, curse God and die. That's why English translations say curse God and die. So what does she do? She's a fulcrum. She's a mechanism to get us into the story and to say, remember your option. Remember option one, curse God and die. And Job doesn't do that. In fact, discourse, dialogue, debate happens. So the text is pushing us to say, don't quit. Don't quit. Keep going. Talk, right? It's going to be tough. People are going to say wrong things, but it's our lot in life. We have to do it. And to do so, remember what happens at the end of Job? God finally responds. Discourse among community, discourse among humans about God, God participates in that, right? It's the way that we can cope together and bring God into the conversation. But outside of that, I'd have to think long and hard about the functionality of Job's wife. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
If Job is something of a parallel to the Israelite nation going through the horrors of the exile.
Yeah.
The problem in my mind with that is that parallel texts like Jeremiah do not hold the Israelite people as innocent and righteous. It's more like, I told you this was going to happen. So here you go.
Yeah, good. Beautiful. So the question is, if Job is a in miniature of the nation of Israel in exile, we've got a theological discrepancy, because in Job, he hasn't done anything wrong. We know he hasn't done anything wrong. Whereas the Israelites who suffer exile have indeed done something wrong. And the prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Lamentations, all these texts, they make that abundantly clear over and over and over again. Very true. So what do we do with that? Well, there's actually another strand of that exile tradition in the Bible where you get kind of flutterings of the righteous remnant of Israel also suffering. Okay? So, for example, Psalm chapter 44, very famously, if you want to take a look at that one, that is clearly, it's being spoken by a group of righteous people who say from the outset, Lord, we didn't do anything to deserve the exile. We followed your Torah, we revere you, we have good relationship with you, and yet we're like lamb to the slaughter, dying every day. What did we do wrong? We didn't do anything wrong. Or Psalm 89, gorgeous, long psalm about saying, it starts, the first half is like, bless the Lord, It's amazing that God chose David as a special king and promised David, I'll never forsake you. No matter what, even if your descendants rebel against me, there'll never be somebody on the throne outside the Davidic line. And I'm going to make a covenant with you, a contract. I promise you, David, right? And then the second half of this very long psalm goes, and yet we're in exile. So what gives? God. It takes God to task. Really takes God to task. Job is like weak compared to Psalm 89. If you want to look at something that's in the canon that is like shocking, read Psalm 89. Or Isaiah 53, very famous passage, right? In Christianity, traditionally, this text is understood as a precursor of Jesus. Jesus would recapitulate the experience of the suffering servant of the Lord. And it says in Isaiah 53:10, Vadonai hafetz dako, meaning it was the Lord's will to crush the servant and to cause him pain, even though there was no deceit in his mouth, and he said nothing wrong. Well, in Isaiah 53, the original referent of the servant of God is the righteous remnant of Israel. And Jesus, in his individual life, recapitulates that righteous remnant, dying even though he didn't deserve it, and dying for the sins to atone for the sins of his people, of his nation. That's exactly what Isaiah says about the righteous remnant in the exile. So that is all to say, Rob, there are traditional materials in the Old Testament that also have the Jobian strand, the good guy who suffers for no reason. And it's even like, well, of course you're going to suffer for no reason. Like, for example, if your whole nation is kind of garbage, not all of them. I mean, there are good guys within the ancient Israel, of course. By the way, I almost want to strike that from the record. I love ancient Israel with every fiber of my being. And yeah, they screw up. But somebody like Jeremiah, Isaiah, righteous kings, Josiah, people like this, they don't deserve it, but they're going to get swept away with the rest of the nation when the Babylonians come in. They can't do anything about it. So I think that Job is a meditation in part on that righteous remnant problem. That's a really good question, Rob. Yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
Earlier in your lecture, you tried to help us understand the nature of Job,
Mm-hmm.
the inherent truth, but layers of epic poetry, the narrative elasticity that phrase you use.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of other, on the face of it, confusing parts of the Bible. The
Sure.
Tower of Babel,
Yep.
Noah and the Ark.
Yep.
Now, each of those had a placement in the timeline of the Old Testament as we understand it. But to what extent would you apply some of those same characteristics to those stories, Noah's Ark and the Tower of Babel?
Sure. Yeah, so Noah's Ark and the Tower of Babel are what scholars call the primordial history. And Job is trying to sound like that. Yeah? So again, the language is meant to push us all the way back to like a far-flung time, So this is Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is the primordial history. I've been in seminary classes both as a student and as a teacher, and I'll get things like, well, my professor said in undergrad that, nothing in the primordial history is historical, okay? It's not until you get to Abraham in chapter 12 where you could get something, this professor who told this student that probably doesn't even believe Abraham existed as well, by the way. But in any case, you'll get this a lot, like, Noah, whatever. None of that is historical. My view differs, but again, it's a kind of in-betweeny, just like I was talking about Job. So Noah's a really interesting case because the idea of a Mesopotamian flood happening in history is one of the surest ancient truths that we have. The reason that I know this is because it is dictated in all sorts of ancient Mesopotamian literature throughout the ancient world. The Bible, Genesis 6 through 8, 6 through 9, is one piece of evidence for that, yeah? But then there's like the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, or the Epic of Atrahasis, or the Sumerian version of Gilgamesh. There's all these different narratives. The fact that that happened in history is, I would die on that hill, okay? So the Bible then is talking about an historical event and weighing in on the theology, the lesson to be gleaned from that historical event. So, for example, in the Gilgamesh story, which predates the Bible by 800 years, probably, the Noah character is called Utnapishtim. I'm glad that our version is Noah, because Utnapishtim does not roll off the tongue of a 4-year-old at Sunday school quite as well. But the story is vastly similar in some ways, and in other ways it's not. So, in fact, the word Noah, the name Noah, Noach, in Hebrew, means to rest, and the ark comes to rest to Noach on Mount Ararat at the end. So, just like Job means enemy, it's pushing us in a narrative direction here. So, was there a figure, right, in the primordial history to whom God or the gods, spoke? Yeah, sure. All these stories say as much. It's just that in the Mesopotamian stories that predate the Bible, the gods send the flood because humans are too loud and the gods can't get to sleep. And then Utnapishtim comes off the boat and makes a sacrifice, just like Noah does to God in the Bible. And it even says the gods smelled the sweet savor of the sacrifice. In the Hebrew, in the Bible, it says that God, the one God, smelled the reach nihoach, the sweet-smelling savor of the sacrifice. Exact same. Remember when Noah sends out a raven and then a dove, and the dove comes back to him with the thing? In the Babylonian accounts, multiple Babylonian accounts, Utnapishtim does the exact same thing. Sends out a raven, sends out a dove. Same, okay? But why is the Bible written in the first place? It's making a theological claim about the truth and character of the true God, which is our God is not so vindictive and petty to send a flood to destroy the world because they can't get to sleep. Why is the world destroyed in Genesis? Because the world is filled with violence, and every thought of every human being is always bad all the time. The Hebrew text bends over backwards to say that we're the problem. In fact, it says in Hebrew that humanity destroyed its way on the earth. And thus, God's going to send a flood to destroy the earth. That is, humans destroyed the world before God does, according to the Hebrew narrative. Unfortunately, in English, they'll say things like, and humanity had corrupted its way upon the earth. Corrupted, and then they'll use destroyed for God sending the flood. The Hebrew word's the exact same. It says over and over and over in Hebrew, humanity destroyed its way on the earth, humanity destroyed itself, destructive. And then God says, an end of all flesh has come before me, says God. Meaning, look at this. I didn't do this. And behold, now I'm flooding the earth, right? And God's sad, not angry, yeah? Whereas the gods of Mesopotamia are angry and petty, the God of Israel is sad, remorseful, and ethical. I think it's historical, yeah? But it's a Hebrew spin on a history. And the Hebrew spin is for the purposes of teaching us, we believers in that God of Israel, who that God is and why that God is so much better than the other gods. Exactly. So what are we to make with that God, the God of the Noah narrative, making a deal, a wager with the Satan? I'm saying the at the front, by the way. I'll get to that next week. But that's what it is in Hebrew. Ha-Satan, the Satan. Satan means adversary or accuser. So really, in Hebrew, it just means the adversary. What are we to make of the God of the Noah story making a wager with the Satan? It's a good question. It's weird, for sure. And again, the ancient Israelite reader would have been like, huh? It's like, does God act that way? Is God going to say, well, but the thing is, God, yeah. We're going to see that God, this is within the wheelhouse of God's activity, okay? And I think that once we kind of massage a little bit and get into some of the roots of that wager story, that I'll hopefully be able to present it in a way for you that makes a little bit more sense. But then I'll have to wait till next week. Yeah, Jen. Correct. Yep. Well, exactly. That's right. So it's a kind of a tit for tat kind of a thing, right? What did you do? You must have done something bad if some bad things are happening to you. So that's what they would have thought, but they would have had good reason for thinking that, because that's what Deuteronomy says. That's what Deuteronomy says. It says at the end, if you do good, good will go with you. If you do bad, bad will happen to you. So of course Job's friends are going to be like, what? Deuteronomy says it, right? So think about this now. This is the thing I'll leave you with. Think about the chutzpah, right? The boldness, the cheek of this writer of Job, or group of writers, we don't know. Basically what this is, at base, is an eyebrow raise to Deuteronomy. That's what's happening here. And this is the beauty of the biblical canon, too. It's written by many hands over many different years. It's not monolithic. It's multivocal. So it's saying, all right, I'm going to give you a test case on this whole Deuteronomistic theology. Does this cash out all the time? No, not the way I'm looking at life, it doesn't. And then if it doesn't, where's God? Right? How do we understand God if that's the case? That is, it's criticizing, not like in a bad way or a negative way, but like it is putting on the table Deuteronomy and saying, let's talk about it. Wild. Amazing. The multivocality of the Bible is why, A, it's so interesting, and B, why we'll never stop learning new things about it. Because it enters into its own discourse with itself over the course of centuries. And it's all in the same authoritative canon, right? Job is just as authoritative as whatever, Isaiah or Deuteronomy. And yet, Job is just kind of poking at Deuteronomy a little bit and seeing what happens. It's great. It's wonderful. All right. I'll be done. Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to be talking about Job. Next week's going to be super wild. So just trust me. You know I love you, okay? Yeah? You know I love you. And I'm just trying to read the Bible as closely as I can. There's going to be some stuff that is going to go, we're going to go, what? Yeah, right. Put the Ephesians armor to defeat the wiles of the evil one. Yeah, exactly. Sure. No, it's not going to be anything like that. But I'm looking forward to it. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Yeah.